So this is a diagram showing you what's taking place, like which hormones are dominant at which point in the reproductive cycle, what's happening in the ovary, what's happening in the uterus. And so this is an entire reproductive cycle, which happens on average about 28 days once the onset of puberty happens. And so this is showing you levels of FSH and LH, what's happening in the ovary in relation to the hormone levels, which hormones are being produced by the ovaries, right here, and how these correspond to what's taking place in the uterus. And so what this is showing you is the endometrial lining of the uterus. The endometrium is the innermost lining. This is where implantation would take place. Myometrium is the middle layer. This is the smooth muscle that aids in uterine wall contractions when sperm are swimming through the uterus up to the fallopian tubes, but also aids in uterine wall contractions when the female is birthing a child. And then the outermost lining, which would come into contact with the other organs in the pelvic cavity, would be the perimetrium, which would be a connective tissue covering. And so here you can see that, and the endometrium, the innermost lining, this changes extensively. You can see changes extensively throughout a reproductive cycle. And so this is showing you day one would be when menses starts. Menses is the sloughing off of the endometrial lining and the release of blood when the necrotic tissue is being released. So day one is the start of menses, okay? And so this is showing you days 1 through 14, and then 14 through 28 is the second half. So follicle-stimulating hormone is the dominant hormone in around days 1 through 14, and follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates follicle development. And multiple follicles will start to mature and develop, but one will win out, and you can see that it's undergoing from a primordial to a primary to a secondary to a Graafian, okay? Now there is still LH, right? But around day 14, there is a huge surge of LH, right? This huge surge of LH causes ovulation, that Graafian follicle to rupture, releasing the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tubes. Now, because follicle-stimulating hormone is the predominant hormone, days 1 through 14, that means estrogen is going to be the dominant hormone that's being released by the ovaries, because FSH stimulates follicular cells to produce and release estrogens. Now, this increased levels of estrogen causes the, after menses, after the sloughing off of that old necrotic endometrium has taken place, high levels of estrogen causes a proliferative phase of the endometrial lining. And proliferative meaning it's thickening, right? And there's abundant endometrial glands being formed, right? So this is proliferative. It's proliferating. It's becoming nice and fluffy for possible implantation. Now, so around day 14, this would be ovulation because of that surge of LH. And then days 14 through 28, you can see that LH is the dominant hormone, okay? Now, LH goes to those follicular cells that are left over in the ovary and causes them to turn into a corpus luteum. And then it tells the corpus luteum to release progesterone. So you can see that progesterone is now the dominant hormone being released by the ovaries. And this progesterone maintains the endometrial lining for possible implantation. It also causes the endometrium to undergo the secretory phase. And the secretory phase means that those endometrial glands are producing lots and lots of nutrient-rich secretions, because if there's implantation, a developing zygote and developing fetus is going to need lots and lots of nutrients. So it causes the secretory phase. Now, if fertilization and implantation does not take place, then there's no need for this corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum degenerates into a corpus albicans, which is just essentially scar tissue. So this is showing the pre-ovulatory or the proliferative phase. So here's our endometrial lining. It's nice and fluffy, and all of those circular structures, those are all endometrial glands. And the endometrial glands are very circular. So this is the proliferative phase of the uterus. That's what you would have to tell me. The specific phase, proliferative, and the fact that it's from the uterus. Now, some of the slides will say progravid or secretory. This is the secretory stage, and it's evidenced by these corkscrew-like, these highly coiled endometrial glands. So this is the secretory phase of the uterus. This is menses. This is evidenced by the tearing off of the tissue. Sometimes you'll even see abundant red blood cells, as well as you'll see very few, if any, endometrial glands because all of the endometrial lining is sloughing off. So what happens is, these arteries, so once the endometrial lining is proliferating, these blood vessels have to innervate this developing or proliferating tissue to give it abundant nutrients, right? Well, when fertilization or implantation if it does not take place, well, then we don't need to continuously waste all of these nutrients for this tissue if we're not going to have implantation take place. So those arteries snap back, right? And when they snap back, now all of this tissue isn't receiving the nutrients and the oxygen that it needs to be able to sustain itself. So it starts to undergo necrosis and die, which is necrosis, tissue death. And so that's why during menses, it's not just blood that is exiting, it's also tissue. It's all of this endometrial lining that has undergone necrosis, okay? And the arteries also rupture, aiding in a mass blood flow, which will help dislodge all that necrotic tissue to be released to the outside during menses. Here, this is another histology slide that you need to be able to identify. This is the vagina. And the vagina, I know we haven't talked about this yet, the vaginal canal, the function is to allow for insertion of the penis during sexual intercourse. It is also to convey the offspring to the outside. It also helps convey uterine secretions to the outside. So, and the vagina, because it's open to the outside and subject to abrasion, especially during sexual intercourse, we see this epithelium, you guessed it, stratified squamous epithelium. Lots and lots of layers so that cells can slough off and you can regenerate more. Again, stratified squamous epithelium, this would be of the vagina, okay? So, and this will look if you look at an epidermis slide, yeah, you see stratified squamous epithelium, but it's not, the vagina won't be keratinized, so the cells towards the apical surface won't be as flattened, and that's one of the indicators if you're trying to distinguish between epidermis and vagina. So here, ovaries, two ovaries. These structures at the ends of the fallopian tubes, those are fimbriae. Again, they do a sweeping motion to suck up the oocyte into the fallopian tubes. Here are the fallopian tubes, also called oviducts or uterine tubes. Here's the uterus, which looks like an inverted pear. This bubbled up portion, this superior portion, this is the fundus. This is the body where it's funneling down. And then this region, which protrudes into the vaginal canal, this is the cervix. Here's the vaginal canal. Here's the vaginal orifice, which is open to the outside. And you'll see that there are folds in the vaginal canal. And these folds are called vaginal rugae that allows the vagina to expand during childbirth, also expand and elongate during sexual intercourse. And these Bartholin's glands or vestibular glands, these produce lubricating fluids during sexual intercourse so that the abrasive forces during sexual intercourse aren't enough to cause open wounds in the vaginal canal. Here's a sagittal section. Here, this is the uterus, real thick myometrium, right? So this big, thick middle layer, it's lots and lots of smooth muscle, way more than this collapsed structure, which is the bladder. So the bladder, the urethra, and the urethral orifice are anterior or ventral to the uterus. This would be the cervix, which protrudes down into the vaginal canal. Here's the vaginal canal with its vaginal rugae. Here's the vaginal orifice. This would be the rectum, anus. Here's our ovary, fimbriae, fallopian tubes. Just pointing out lots of structures. Here's our ureter coming down, which would come to and enter into the backside of the bladder. Now, this region, this thick fat pad that's anterior to the pubic symphysis, this is called the mons pubis. And I'll talk about the external genitalia in just a second, but here's the mons pubis. This would be the labia minora, and the outer fold would be the labia majora. And so here is a better image of the vulva, and the vulva is a collective term for all of the external genitalia of the female reproductive system. And so here, these outer folds, okay, these are the labia majora. Hair follicles are present, so you'll see hair, sebaceous glands, scent glands, all on the labia majora. Those are absent. Hair and sebaceous glands are absent on the labia minora. And the labia majora on the anterior side merge to form the mons pubis, which has abundant adipose in the subcutaneous tissue. So during sexual intercourse or just every day, bumping, into things, you protect the very delicate reproductive organs that are contained within the pelvic cavity. Labia majora just helps protect the delicate external reproductive organs, as well as enclose and protect the urethral orifice, which is anterior to the vaginal orifice, which is posterior. Here's the labia minora because they're smaller folds, also same function to protect the urethral orifice and vaginal orifice. No hair is present, and they merge to form, on the anterior side, the labia minora merge to form a clitoral hood, which covers and protects the clitoris, which is analogous to the penis. The labia majora is actually analogous to the scrotum in males. And the clitoris is similar to what the glans penis in the males does. Its function, it contains lots of sensory receptors for sexual stimulation and sexual arousal. Urethral orifice, posterior vaginal orifice, even more posterior anus. Okay. The vestibule is an area that contains, or is where you see, the vestibule is where you see the urethral orifice and the vaginal orifice. And it's those vestibular glands that are going to produce the majority of lubricating fluids during sexual intercourse. Only a small volume of lubricating fluid comes from the males, and that would be from those bulbal urethral glands. So upon sexual stimulation, we have an erection, and that would be due to the clitoris. So the clitoris, it's analogous to the penis. It contains erectile tissues, erectile columns. Sexual stimulation causes the clitoris to swell and elongate. This causes, elongation means that it's more easily stimulated and would lead to a possible orgasm, which would lead to uterine wall contractions, which would help propel the sperm to the fallopian tubes. Lubrication, those Bartholin's glands that are contained in the vestibular area secrete mucus that helps lubricate the vaginal orifice for an easier insertion of the penis and reduce friction and reduce the possibility of wounds in the vaginal canal. In the vaginal canal, it's really abundant bacteria. It's a normal microbiome, but we don't want abrasive forces causing wounds that would allow the bacteria into our systems. And then upon sufficient sexual stimulation, there's a culmination of the physiologic and psychologic culmination of sexual pleasure as an orgasm, which causes uterine wall contractions, propelling the sperm to the fallopian tubes. So if you want implantation to take place, fertilization needs to happen in the fallopian tube so that the correct number of cellular divisions takes place before that developing zygote reaches the uterus so that it can implant into the endometrial lining.